talked a lot about all of the different functions that the CAN system has to provide, and I think we even got a sense of this challenge. Yeah, I have mine. This challenge in your plot that you showed of each of the function and where the different resins performed. But I'm curious, what was the hardest functional characteristic to provide? Is it shelf life? Is it universality? Where did the things fail?
So that was going to be very resin dependent, and I think I understand that there are can manufacturers who are in the room or on the call, and I would really encourage someone or more than one of you to call in, because I think that answer is more complicated than it seems, because the chemistries are more complicated than what I put up there. So I'm dodging your question a little bit, but I think we really could use the help of people, the chemists who are making these products. Yeah, because I think it's really important to recognize how many different functions something that's relatively simple provides. And that gives a lot of points for failure. And a similar question to you, in durable water repellency, the consumer-facing function may be relatively simple to understand, but how about within the supply chain? Where are the challenges in adopting a new resin? What are the benchmarks similar to what Judy showed in the can manufacturing, where are the problems?
So I would say that from a consumer benefit, let me start there, getting oil repellency with PFC-free chemicals is impossible today. And oil repellency is really important for uniforms, school uniforms and things like that. Less so for durable water repellency, but PFCs are also used to repel stains, oil-based stains. In the supply chain, I would say ideally you want to be able to use the same equipment so actually get the product on the fabric in the same way. Durability is probably the most difficult issue that we're currently facing. And the way you test water repellency is you literally wash and dry the garment. So you would expect to have some level of water repellency after a certain number of washes. So for khaki pants, you're going to wash them more than a jacket. But you would need to have a level of durability that is acceptable to your brand. So I think those are the two biggest challenges.
Excellent. I saw some questions coming up. Are there some questions while I'm reading these from the audience? Yeah.
I have a question for Amanda. So I have a question for Amanda. Is that on? Yeah. Is that okay? That's better. So I have a question for Amanda, and your presentation was really fascinating, and I think it does apply to a lot of different industries. And I'm trying to wrap my head around the supply chain obstacle, especially in apparel, because, as you said, there's a global supply chain. And you talked about manufacturers making their expectations clear to suppliers. Is there anywhere within that formula for penalties for non-compliance? So I mean specifically, like, can a Levi Strauss, say to a supplier, we're going to be spot checking you, and if we find chemicals that are on our RSL list, we're going to move to another supplier, or we're going to fine you, or we're going to hold you liable?
Yes, and I won't talk specifically about Levi's, but in general, manufacturers of apparel need to adhere to a brand restricted substance list. So there's, all sorts of chemicals on that. Sensitizing dyes, the fluorinated chemicals, APEOs, phthalates. I mean, it's the usual suspects. The apparel is tested for the presence of those chemicals. Now, when you test apparel, you destroy it. So it's not very desirable to do that. Most brands have auditors that live in the countries that manufacture their product that will go in and do spot checks. They'll go in and do an overall audit. yes, you have fines, you have corrective actions, and if it doesn't improve, then chances are the brand will move away into a different supplier. The industry is trying to use the same audit protocol because it's expensive to audit products, and it makes more sense if we're all going after the same issue, that we actually collaborate and align on audit protocol and testing. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
Excellent. And actually, a little bit of a follow-up to that question from someone in the audience. What drove Levi Strauss to get PFCs out of the material, and how long was that timeline? And would you say that it was kind of forced by regulation or consumer demand? So a little more of the backstory.
Okay, specific to Levi's. Levi's launched a product called Dockers with Stain Defender in 2001 using C8 chemicals, or the long-chain perfluorinated chemicals. Very quickly, that product flew off the shelves. It was very, very successful. So very quickly, we started in the R&D function, which is where I was, working with the chemical supplier to find an alternative to that. The requirement was that it matched the performance that we needed. That process took about 3 to 4 years, actually finding a safer alternative, all the way from 2001 to 2005. The Levi brand introduced a product called Commuter. It's a pant, a jean made for cycling, and they added a perfluorinated chemical. They didn't even add the C8, they went straight to a C6. That again was a very successful launch. We did a tremendous amount of due diligence with the chemical supplier and with our risk management department, and we felt that it was a product that was safe to put on the shelves. So that was about 2009 or 2010. And then what I think really accelerated the move away from perfluorinated chemicals for Levi's is the detox campaign, the public commitment to phase out of all perfluorinated chemicals by, I want to say the end of 2018, but I can't remember, but it's a public commitment. But we bought ourselves at least 2 years to actually transition away from C6 to PFC-free. And we felt that it's something that we could do and that we could do successfully. And I believe that Levi's met that requirement ahead of its scheduled timeline. So it takes a while, right? You need a dedicated team that is looking for safer alternatives. You need someone that's able to work with chemical companies. And you need to really understand the supply chain to make sure that you're testing the product correctly and that you're working with the chemical company to help with that testing as well.
Excellent.
This is also a question for Amanda. In your presentation, you, I think, noted that brands collectively have come together to help identify potential solutions to the perfluorinated chemicals in this example, and that one approach that they've used is to collectively, I think I heard this right, collectively go to the chemical industry to see what solutions may be available to provide direction in terms of expectations. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
You did. Yeah.
So then my question, okay, good, because then my question makes sense. So my question was, what has worked well and what has proven challenging in those types of conversations where it's not possibly multiple brands talking to multiple chemical manufacturers?
I think if you've got one brand talking to one chemical company, it's not worth them doing the R&D and making the change. And the feedback was C6 is safe, it's okay. Once Greenpeace started their detox campaign, once brands publicly signed up to phase out of chemicals, and once the trade associations such as the Outdoor Industry Apparel Association started to work together, all of a sudden you've got a very big collective voice that can be very influential in the industry. So that was one benefit. And then at the same time, I believe that NASA did a green chemistry program called Launch with Nike. And I believe that GC3, the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, they've all thrown out innovation challenges to beyond the chemical industry to really find replacements to perfluorinated chemicals. They know it's an opportunity, right? There's definitely a benefit. There's business at the end of it if you can really solve the issue. There's a small chemical company called Beyond Surface Technologies that the Patagonia Foundation has funded to find a safer alternative. So all of a sudden, there are all of these sort of rewards for doing the R&D, because at the end of the day, if a chemical company is going to change its processes, there needs to be a reason for that. They need to see a business benefit for doing it. And I think by the industry aligning, it's really moved it in the right direction. And just to be clear, short-chain perfluorinated chemicals, to my knowledge, are not regulated at this point in time. I don't know whether they will be, but again, it's this idea of getting ahead of regulations and being more proactive. And then if you throw in the Scandinavian countries, they're aggressively going after long-chain perfluorinated chemicals. So it's this massive change across the global supply chain. Did that answer your question? Okay.
And we have another question here that is for both of you regarding the collaborative approaches. It's specifically asking about what do you think are some of the barriers to EPA or other industries, so cross-industry collaboration. Amanda, you talked a lot about the textile industry. You mentioned using the EPA as one of the ways that you evaluated things. Moving beyond just within the industry collaboration, do you see barriers to this sort of cross-industry collaboration? Do you think it's possible? Could something like an alternative for BPA benefit from looking beyond just the industry that they work in?
I think the short answer is yes. I think one of the barriers is trust. And I think there was, at least, in my professional lifetime, there was a time when it was much easier to have folks from industry and EPA and others and NGOs sitting at a table together to talk about issues like this. And I think, at least from what I've seen, it's become much more difficult. And I think that's it's to our detriment, because each group has a different area of expertise. They may come in, everybody comes in with their own history, their own agenda, their own areas of influence, but all of those are needed in the conversation. And if there are pathways toward rebuilding trust, I think that's going to be essential.
And I would say the biggest barrier to perfluorinated chemicals is IP, so intellectual property. These chemicals are added as a point of differentiation. So it's been really, really hard for some brands to agree to phase out of perfluorinated chemicals because they're very concerned about what their consumer feels from a quality perspective. But then you do have this intellectual property. So if Levi's finds an alternative, they may not want to share that immediately. They want to go ahead and be able to market that first. So I think that's a big barrier. It's a little bit different if it's a chemical, a processed chemical such as an APEO, which is used in detergents. They're just really effective detergents. Then it becomes much easier for the industry to work together. But once you're actually marketing an initiative such as durable water repellency, you do have that IP piece that you want to protect for as long as you can. Any brand is going to want to get ahead.
I think one other thing to maybe mention with a lot of these chemicals of concern, they're actually used across industries. PFCs aren't just used in the textile industry. Bisphenol A isn't just used in food contact. It's also in receipts. It's also in other things. One of the both opportunities for collaboration there is that there are other people looking at alternatives outside of your own industry. One of the barriers for collaboration there is in some cases, especially say BPA and receipts versus can linings, the function is actually quite different. So the reason why you've chosen BPA isn't exactly the same. Yeah. So I think there's more opportunity when the function is conserved across the industries than in the case where the function is not conserved across the industries, because it really is oftentimes functional replacements that'll come to the forefront. We have a couple more from the audience. Yeah, we have the mic, and then we'll bring the mic up here.
Hi, this is Nancy Biermeyer with the Breast Cancer Fund. This has been fascinating and a great learning experience. I have a question about sort of the origin of the process. You've talked a lot about retailers and manufacturers working with chemical companies and working across the industry. I'm curious sort of at the beginning how much pushback the brands get about the safety of the chemical. Like the conversation around BPA has moved to how do we change it because there's so much consumer concern, but the beginning of the conversation, at least with the trade associations, is it is safe. And I'm just curious how much the chemical companies that you work with start from the premise of we don't need to change this because it's safe, and this is all just junk science and hype.
So I've worked with the chemical industry my whole career, and I haven't heard them refer to data as junk science. I think what they've been very effective at doing is sharing their QA process as it relates to the safety of their chemicals. So they put their chemicals through a risk assessment. I think the challenge is that that risk assessment isn't good enough. So how do we move from a risk-based assessment to a hazard-based assessment? And this is a very, very big discussion point. I'm actually quite a greenie. I'm quite into hazard-based assessments rather than risk-based. But I think there's a happy medium. To my earlier point, I think it's critical that if brands are going to start working with the chemical industry, that they need somebody that's technical and has a chemistry background that can actually understand what the chemical industry is telling them. And I feel quite strongly about that. But it really starts right at that point, right? So you want to go back to the chemical industry, be able to look at their data, be able to challenge their data. And in many cases, their data is fantastic. But at the same time, I do think that what we need to do as brands is start moving towards a hazard-based assessment, or perhaps a third-party certified assessment of safer chemicals. In the textile industry, we have Blue Sign, we have Okotex, and those are really good third-party programs that I think are critical, but they're not necessarily risk-based, and they're not necessarily as transparent as I think they should be.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
So I feel compelled, as the president-elect of the International Society of Exposure Science, I would be remiss if I didn't at least add a layer to your discussion. So I think in your talk you said that the manufacturers should have a chemist. And I was sitting there taking notes thinking they should also have an exposure scientist. So the difficulty with hazard-based assessments and just stopping it there is that you can have a chemical that might appear to have a higher or a more toxic profile, but the exposure is basically nil. And that's the importance of carrying through to the end of a risk assessment, because you need both. You need to understand the toxicity, and you need to understand the exposure. If you have a lower toxicity chemical, you're doing your alternatives assessment, you have 6 chemicals to choose from, and you pick the one that has the lowest toxicity profile. It may be that the exposure is so high that in the end, your risk calculation is going to give you the worst risk profile for the chemical. And so I would argue that I think both are essential, and that the risk paradigm and the risk assessment paradigm, while not perfect, is something that we've been using for decades and we've been improving on for decades, and that, at least when I used to teach this, I always talk about it being a yardstick. I think it's a pretty effective yardstick for giving us an understanding of how to compare across chemicals, across contaminated sites, across a whole wide array of situations and chemical mixtures. And there's going to be plenty of room for improvement with risk assessment, but I think without exposure, we're missing a key piece.
And we will talk about both hazard and exposure in the afternoon session. So we're set to address both pieces of the puzzle. One of the things, we are getting great questions. I love this audience. One of the things that always comes up for me is kind of the order and where you invest your time, how quickly. So I think there's a lot of early screening that we can do based on hazard to then figure out how far down we need to go in figuring out exposure. And sometimes we have chosen to do it the other way and wait to find out that there is an exposure before asking the question of hazard. So for me, I completely agree that both are essential, but I sometimes wonder if we ask the questions in the right order. But that's another layer to the puzzle, right? Mm-hmm. It's a continuously evolving process. Another one from the audience, and I'll go back to these. You want to go for it, Meredith?
Meredith Williams, DTSC. And Amanda, I wanted to ask you about the standards that you referenced a few times. You said they set very high standard for the performance of these chemicals on their textiles, but you didn't say why. Is it, if you start with C8 and your benchmark is the performance of C8, that's going to set a pretty high ceiling.
Yep.
And so I wondered how, what other factors went into determining what those standards look like?
That's a great question. So within the textile industry, you have standards, ATSM and AATCC standards, American Association of Textile Chemists and Colorists. So those are methods, and then they have a threshold pass-fail rate. The standards for durable water repellent, so I can speak only from a Levi perspective. When we launched Dockers with Stain Defender, we had a requirement of a drop rating of 3 after 30 home launderings. What that basically means is that beads of water would still roll off the garment. The reason we chose 30 home launderings is very simple, because we wanted to be the best out there and we wanted to have the highest quality product. And we assumed that the lifetime of a pair of khakis was 30 home launderings, and that was washing about once a week. So it's as simple as that. With the Levi brand, when they launched Stain Defender, they had that same 3 threshold, and then I believe that they decided that 10 home launderings was sufficient because they went in with C6 and not C8, and it's a lot more difficult to get repellency on denim versus a lighter weight, more tightly constructed fabric. That 10 home launderings was hard to achieve, but they felt that with their marketing campaign around washing your jeans less, from an energy and water perspective, was a good marriage, that they could actually get away with that 10 home launderings. I don't know how often all of you wash your khakis and how often you expect them to last, or your denim, but it's really, a lot is based on how you market your product and your brand reputation.
And before we go back to the audience, I'm going to ask a couple here, and then I got you, Simona, and then we have the next one up here. It's great. So back to the can industry and the linings for a second. A question from the audience about how long epoxy linings have been used and what was used before them. So a little bit of that historical context, and also whether or not those same linings are used in the sort of waxed boxes or that are sold with soups, tomatoes, other sorts of things.
Yeah, okay, so knew I should have memorized these dates before I came here. So cans, I believe, first began to be used in the early 1800s, and epoxy resins, I believe, were introduced, I want to say in the early 1900s, but let me check that and get back to you. But they've been in use for quite a while. And in terms of the boxes, I don't know how those are lined.
Yeah. I know they're not, actually.
They're
those
not lined.
boxes aren't.
These are, what I was told at one point was the main issue with the boxes, although a lot of soups are moving in this direction, is that they can't withstand the same kind of packing pressure. So you can stack sort of almost probably an infinite number of cans, right, end to end, but those can't withstand the same weight. And so you asked me before which thing is going to fail first, and I suspect it may be more of a storage and transport issue than a resin issue.
Than a resin issue.
Yeah.
You want to hop in with the answer to the resin?
Those boxes that, kind of the paperboard boxes are lined with polyethylene.
Yeah.
And going to low-density polyethylene.
Exactly. Then metal, then paper, then more plastic.
The ones that don't need to be refrigerated have a thin layer of aluminum. Most of them don't.
Those, yeah, exactly. All right. Yeah, exactly. Back to the back.
Okay, Simona Balandi, TSC. I have a question for Amanda also. I'm wondering, given that the major apparel brands have phased out C8 and other longer chains, and that the shorter chains and the non-fluorine alternatives to date don't work as well, what are the companies doing in terms of marketing their products? Do they have to somehow market their reduced performance? What are they doing to keep their customers?
I don't know. I don't shop very often. Sorry. I honestly don't think the consumer knows what a PFC is. I think a consumer knows what durable water repellency means, and I think that the C6 chemistry and the non-fluorinated alternatives are giving durable water repellency, right? I don't think that that performance is lasting as well. I haven't seen any packaging that says PFC free, but I don't shop the market either, so I'm not the best person to ask. I think within the apparel industry, it's a difficult advertising or marketing campaign to start talking about chemicals on your clothes, because I don't think the consumer necessarily associates chemicals with apparel. So I think you'll find that apparel brands are treading very, very carefully around this issue. So I'm sorry. I wish I was an expert on shopping, but I'm not.
Yeah, that's okay.
So we're actually running a little short on time. It's 10:30, right? Two more minutes. All right, so the last question then, and this has come from a couple of different directions, but I think it is quite relevant, and so I want to ask it to both of you, which is, what is a manufacturer to do in the time frame between an identified chemical of concern and the alternatives that they may want to bring on to market? So it's a little bit of a follow-on from Simona about messaging, and we've gotten other questions about how to deal with the liabilities and what to do if the best alternative is potentially hazardous. So this all kind of works into this question about what do you do in that time period between there's a problem you've identified and you don't yet have a solution.
So I really feel like this belongs in the afternoon session, because if you look at levels of exposure of bisphenol A in the U.S. population today, based on, for example, NHANES, right now, exposures are below EPA's acceptable value, and not just EPA's, but Health Canada and the European Union as well. And so, you know, the bar may move, and people may decide that the reference dose should change. But as of today, our exposures are below a reference dose. And so it raises the question about, are we making a decision as a society to change our entire risk paradigm? Do we believe the risk paradigm that we're currently using for virtually all of our chemicals? And if not, then what are we going to do? What are we left with? And so I think that conversation belongs in this afternoon's session.
Hopefully we've tied you here for all 3 sessions now. Exposure, hazard, and then making decisions. But I want to give you a chance.
And I would say that from an apparel perspective, you have core year-round products and you have seasonal products. So the way the brands work, or the way Levi's worked, is as soon as it identified that it wanted to phase out of C6 chemicals, any new seasonal product was developed with a fluorine-free replacement or alternative. With core products, I believe there was a gradual transition out of the old C6 chemistry. So as you issue a PO and then you buy, I don't know, X thousand yards, once that yardage is finished, any new yardage going forward would be run without PFC chemicals. Seamless transition, no correspondence to the consumer. So that's the way that Levi's handled that situation.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for the questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but we have a break waiting for you outside, and I'd like to thank our speakers this morning.